The federal government is making a deliberate choice, a choice to sacrifice America's largest reservoir to save its upstream twin. And if it fails, the lights go out. Right now, a catastrophic power failure is no longer a worst-case scenario. It is a mathematical certainty, already coded into federal projections. One of the greatest engineering marvels of the 20th century is being pushed toward a cliff, and a state water director in Arizona just went on the record and admitted what everyone in Washington was afraid to say out loud. Catastrophe is not just coming, it is inevitable. So, the real question is this a natural disaster or a man-made one? Let me know in the comments below, because the line is getting blurry. The crisis has already begun. A huge percentage of people who find these stories essential forget to subscribe. If you believe understanding the fragility of our infrastructure is critical, take 1 second and hit that button now. It is the single most important way to support this kind of deep dive reporting, and it guarantees you will not miss what happens next. Let's begin. The number is 1,035 feet. 1035. Burn it into your memory, because it is the number that is keeping engineers in 3 states awake at night. It is not Deadpool. It is something both closer and, in some ways, more insidious. At 1,035 feet above sea level, Lake Mead does not run dry. Hoover Dam does not stop holding back water. But 12 of its 17 turbines will be forced to go silent. That is the point at which physics takes over. The point at which the pressure of the lake is no longer strong enough to protect the machinery that powers cities. The point at which the dam begins to tear itself apart from the inside. They call it cavitation. It is a deceptively simple word for a brutally violent process. Hoover Dam creates electricity through hydraulic head, the immense weight of trillions of gallons of water pressing down, forcing water through giant pipes called penstocks and into the turbines. As the lake level drops, that pressure weakens. At 1,035 feet, the pressure becomes so low that as water rushes into the older turbines, microscopic pockets of air, of nothingness, begin to form. They are just tiny vapor bubbles, harmless, until they collapse. And they collapse with the force of a microscopic depth charge. An implosion so violent it releases a shock wave that can rip hardened steel apart. One bubble is nothing. Millions of bubbles, exploding every second against the blades of a turbine spinning hundreds of times a minute, is catastrophic. It is like being sandblasted with tiny grenades. The turbines are not just damaged, they are shredded, eaten alive by the very water they are meant to control. To prevent this, engineers will have no choice. The moment the lake kisses 1,035 feet, they will initiate a shutdown. 12 turbines, representing the vast majority of Hoover Dam's generating capacity, will go offline. Instantly, the dam's output plunges from over 1,300 megawatts to just 382. In a flash, an energy source for 1.3 million people across Nevada, Arizona, and California is gutted. And that crisis point, that 1,035-foot cliff, is no longer a distant threat. As of this morning, June 26, 2026, Lake Mead sits at 1,045.09 feet. 10 feet away, the lake lost nearly 20 feet in the last year alone. The math is not complicated. Tom Bushatsky, the director of Arizona's Department of Water Resources, said it plainly in mid-May. We're going to go to 1,035. There's no question that's going to happen. The question is no longer if, it is when, and what happens the day after. The video title you clicked on says 25 million people will lose power. That is not entirely accurate, but the truth is more complicated. Hoover Dam provides electricity to about 1.3 million people. The 25 million figure, that is the number of people who depend on the lake's water. 2 different numbers, 2 different crises, born from the same disappearing lake. The power crisis is the first to arrive, and its biggest victim will be a city hundreds of miles away. So who feels the shockwave when Hoover's capacity is slashed by nearly 75%? What would you do if you were in charge? Keep the comments coming. We read all of them. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, LADWP, is Hoover Dam's single largest customer. They purchase anywhere from 15 to over 20% of the total power generated. For decades, that power has been some of the cheapest, cleanest, most reliable hydroelectricity on the planet. A foundational block of the energy grid that keeps the second largest city in America running. When Hoover's output craters, LADWP does not just get less power. the power they can still get becomes exponentially more expensive. Jordi Fuentes, the head of Arizona's power authority, put it in stark terms. We're basically knocking out most of Hoover's generating capacity. When that happens, the resource becomes unaffordable for most of our customers. Affordability is a sanitized word for what really happens. To replace Hoover's lost gigawatts, utilities will have to buy power on the open spot market. That means burning more natural gas. Firing up older, dirtier, and far more expensive peaker plants to meet demand on hot summer afternoons. The cost gets passed on directly to the bills of millions of households and businesses in Southern California and Arizona. The lights might not go out on day one, but keeping them on will suddenly cost a fortune, and every single kilowatt generated will come with a higher carbon price tag. The clean energy promise of the dam, a promise made by President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself at its dedication on September 30th, 1935, will be broken by simple hydrology, by a lake that can no longer push hard enough. The Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that runs the dam, saw this coming. They are not victims of the crisis. They are its architects. In a move that can only be described as hydraulic triage, the Department of the Interior made a calculated decision in early 2026. They decided to save Lake Powell, the upstream reservoir behind Glen Canyon Dam, at the direct expense of Lake Mead. Federal models showed Lake Powell was dangerously close to dropping below its own minimum power pool of 3,490 feet, a drop that would have crippled power generation for communities across Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. So they acted. They cut the annual release of water from Lake Powell downstream to Lake Mead to a historic low, just 6.00 million acre-feet, down from the 7.48 million that was already considered a low baseline. They starved Mead to save Powell. They put one patient on life support by pulling the plug on another. David Palumbo, the acting commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, is now the man managing the fallout of this decision. A decision that made the 1,035-foot crisis at Hoover Dam a near-term certainty. The Bureau's own statement admitted it. This outcome is not a reflection of recent drought response actions, but rather a clear reminder that the Colorado River remains vulnerable. It was an admission of defeat, dressed in the language of bureaucracy. They had chosen a loser, and the loser was Hoover Dam. If you think your friends and family need to see this, need to understand what's really happening to the power grid, hit the like button and share this with them. It makes a real difference. Awareness starts somewhere. But the story of failure is also a story of a desperate, last-minute fight. The engineers at Hoover are not sitting idle, waiting for the cavitation monster to arrive. For years, they have been quietly retrofitting the dam for a future they knew was coming. Between 2011 and 2016, the Bureau of Reclamation spent millions to install 5 brand-new wide-head turbines. These were a different breed of machine. Engineered to operate under far lower hydraulic pressure, they could withstand the forces of cavitation all the way down to a lake elevation of 950 feet. Their installation effectively lowered Hoover Dam's absolute minimum power pool from 1,050 feet to 950 feet. It was a monumental upgrade, an engineering miracle that bought the dam an extra 100 feet of life. And it still was not enough. 5 wide-head turbines meant that 12 of the older, vulnerable turbines remained. As the 1,035-foot power cliff loomed closer and closer in the 2026 projections, the federal government finally blinked. On May 21, 2026, Andrea Travnicek, the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, announced a $52 million emergency investment, an infusion of cash from the Inflation Reduction Act to fast-track the replacement of 3 more of the old turbines with new wide-head models. It is a race against time, a frantic, expensive effort to give the dam a little more breathing room before the lake drops too far. When the work is done, Hoover will have 8 turbines that can fight their way down to 950 feet, but 9 will still go dark. The dam will still lose more than half its generating capacity. The $52 million is not a solution. It is a patch, a tourniquet applied to an arterial bleed. And yet, while the federal government races to patch a dying power source, one city is watching the chaos unfold with an unsettling sense of calm. The one city that should be in the most danger. Las Vegas. While everyone else was panicking about power, Vegas was solving a much bigger problem. The problem of what happens when the water stops entirely. The real Deadpool for Lake Mead. The point where gravity itself prevents any water from flowing downstream past the dam, is 895 feet. At that level, the canals that feed Arizona's farms and California's cities go dry. It is the doomsday scenario for the entire lower Colorado River basin. For Las Vegas, it is just another number, because Las Vegas prepared for the end of the world. They spent $1.5 billion and 7 years doing something that sounds like science fiction. They drilled a 3-mile tunnel through solid rock, hundreds of feet beneath the bottom of Lake Mead. They built a third straw, an intake so deep it sits at an elevation of 860 feet. That is 35 feet below Deadpool. Bronson Mack, the spokesman for the Southern Nevada Water Authority, the agency that owns the straw, said it with the confidence of a man holding a royal flush. We invested as a community and built a deep water intake and a low lake-level pumping station at Lake Mead. Those two facilities secure our access to our water supply, regardless of what Lake Mead's elevation is. It is one of the most audacious and insulated water security projects in human history. If Lake Mead drops to dead pool, the Hoover Dam's outlets become useless. The water stops flowing to Phoenix. It stops flowing to the Imperial Valley's farms. It stops flowing to Mexico. But inside that tunnel, deep below the now useless dam, a separate $200 million pumping station will turn on, and it will keep pulling water into Las Vegas. The fountains at the Bellagio will keep running, not because the crisis was averted, but because one city paid to build an escape hatch while its neighbors were still arguing about who used the last drop. And if you're still with me, and you haven't subscribed, now is your chance. It is the only way to make sure you see the next chapter in this unfolding story. Don't let the algorithm hide it from you. This whole catastrophe, the power crisis, the water crisis, the desperate engineering, it all has a single point of origin. A mistake made more than a century ago, in 1922. That year, the 7 states of the Colorado River Basin came together to sign the Colorado River Compact. It was a gentleman's agreement to divide the spoils of what seemed like an infinitely generous river. They measured the river's flow, they did the math, and they allocated shares to each state. A share for Arizona, a share for California, for Colorado, for Nevada. There was one fatal flaw in their calculation. The years they used to measure the river's flow, the early 20th century, were some of the wettest years the American West had seen in over a millennium. They built their entire legal framework on a historic anomaly, a weather pattern that was the exception, not the rule. They allocated more water on paper than the river actually produces in a normal year. For decades, it didn't matter. The great reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, were so vast they could absorb the deficit. They acted like a massive bank account, and the states were just drawing down the principal. But you can only do that for so long. The structural deficit, the original sin of the 1922 Compact, quietly compounded for 100 years. That overdraft is now coming due, and there is not enough water in the river to pay it back. The story gets worse. That allocated water, the lifeblood of 25 million people, is not even primarily used for people. Up to 80% of all the water diverted from the Colorado River goes to agriculture. It waters vast fields of cotton, lettuce, and citrus in the middle of the desert. And in one of the most surreal paradoxes of this crisis, a significant portion of that water is used to grow alfalfa, a thirsty crop grown in the deserts of Arizona and California, which is then harvested, baled, and shipped thousands of miles to places like Saudi Arabia and China to be used as feed for cattle. We are, in effect, exporting the water of a dying river system out of the country in the form of hay. It is a detail so absurd it sounds like fiction. It is the documented reality of a system that has lost all connection to its own ecological limits. This is not a story about a simple drought. Scientists have stopped using that word. They now call it aridification, a permanent, long-term shift to a hotter, drier climate. It is not a temporary condition that will be fixed by one good snow year. We saw that illusion play out just recently. The winter of 2022-2023 brought record-breaking snowpack to the Rocky Mountains. Lake Mead, which had fallen to a terrifying 26% of capacity, shot up by more than 20 feet. For a moment, it felt like a reprieve, a miracle. But the experts warned against celebration. One wet year does not erase 2 decades of dryness. And they were right. The recovery was fragile, temporary. By 2025, the dry patterns returned. The lake began its inexorable march back down. That one great snow year was just a gasp of air for a drowning system, not a rescue. Beneath the water, another problem is silently growing, literally. Since its completion in 1935, nearly 100 feet of sediment has built up at the bottom of Lake Mead. Silt, sand, and mud, carried downstream by the Colorado, have settled in the reservoir, slowly but surely reducing its total storage capacity. The bottom of the lake is physically higher than it used to be. Every year, the reservoir dies a little bit from the bottom up. That sediment also changes the math of the bathtub ring, the iconic white band of minerals staining the canyon walls. The ring looks dramatic, but it is also deceiving. Because the lake is shaped like a giant martini glass, a 10-foot drop near the top represents a colossal volume of water. A 10-foot drop near the narrow bottom represents far, far less. As the lake shrinks, each foot of elevation it loses corresponds to a smaller and smaller amount of actual water. The decline accelerates as it gets closer to the bottom. I know. This is probably the third time I'm mentioning it. But it's this important. With the way online platforms are working now, if you are not subscribed, you might genuinely never see the conclusion to this story when the deadline hits. Please, take 1 second. It's right there. It helps more than you can possibly imagine. All of this, the politics, the physics, the history, is now hurtling toward a single date on the calendar. December 31st, 2026. That is the day the current operating rules for the river, the 2007 interim guidelines, officially expire. All the agreements that dictate who gets cut, when, and by how much, simply cease to exist. The 7 basin states, Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, are currently locked in the most contentious negotiations in a century. They have to come up with a new plan to share a river that is a shadow of its former self, a plan that will involve brutal, painful, and permanent cuts for everyone. If they fail to reach an agreement by that deadline, the system enters a state of unprecedented chaos. What happens on January 1st, 2027? Does California, with its senior water rights, simply take what it believes it is legally owed, leaving almost nothing for Arizona and Nevada? Do the states sue each other, plunging the entire river system into a legal quagmire that could last for decades while the reservoirs continue to drain? Does the federal government, under a future Secretary of the Interior, have to step in and impose its own solution on unwilling states? No one knows the answer. The rulebook is about to be thrown out, and the game is being played on a board that is shrinking every single day. The title of this video is a hypothetical, a warning of what could happen if the lake drops below the dead pool line of 895 feet. We are not there today. At 1,045 feet, we are still 150 feet above that ultimate doomsday. But we are only 10 feet away from the power cliff, 10 feet away from a crisis that will send economic and electrical shockwaves across the entire Southwest. The dam will not go dark for 25 million people. But the forced shutdown of 12 turbines will cripple the power supply for 1.3 million, and it will set a terrifying precedent. It will be the first time in its 90-year history that the mighty Hoover Dam has been brought to its knees by a lack of water. It is a warning shot, a preview of the much larger catastrophe waiting at 895 feet. A world where the water truly does stop. The engineering that built this system was monumental. It was born of ambition, concrete, and a belief in humanity's ability to tame nature. The third straw beneath Las Vegas is a modern testament to that same spirit, an extraordinary accomplishment. But no amount of engineering can create water that is not there. The tunnel is drilled, the turbines are being replaced, the frantic, last-minute work continues. And all of it is a response to a century-old miscalculation and 2 decades of a climate that has stopped cooperating. The future of the American Southwest is being written right now, in closed-door meetings between water lawyers and in the quiet, relentless evaporation from a shrinking lake. The problem is no longer theoretical. The numbers are on the monthly reports. The crisis is on the horizon. The one question left is whether the solutions will